If you look at this interesting crab, you may very quickly notice that it has a striking feature. This right claw is very large. But it's not just the anatomical feature that's interesting. You may also wonder about the behavior. What does it do with that giant claw? Is it used for catching prey? And it turns out no. This is the claw it uses mostly for eating. This is primarily for waving around and intimidating other males that may come into its mating territory. But as interesting as unique anatomical structures are, sometimes behaviors can be just as interesting. And a behavior is a nervous system's response to a stimulus, and it's carried out by your muscular system or hormonal system. You can also use your glands. And it's subject to natural selection, just like anatomical structures are. The study of behavior is a relatively recent one. It was, the 20th century when a few European biologists really began to study why animals do certain things that they do. And one of the fathers of ethology, which is what we call the study of animal behavior, is Nico Tinbergen. And he, in a very important paper, outlined four main questions that you can approach studying a behavior with. And the first one is, what stimulus elicits the behavior, and what is the physiological mechanism that mediates the response? So, in other words, what directly causes that behavior to occur, and how does it happen, right? Is there a neuron that controls it? Is there a gland that controls it? Which muscles are involved, et cetera, et cetera? Is it a visual cue or an auditory cue or something you smell that stimulates that behavior, right? These are all very functional questions about how this behavior occurs. The second one is, how does the animal's experience during growth and development influence this response? Essentially, how does this behavior come about during that animal's lifetime? Is it learned? Is it innate? If it's innate, is it because of a hormone that comes about during some part of development? So these are the how questions. How does this behavior occur during an organism's life? The next two are why questions. Why is this behavior evolve? These have to do with evolution. So number three is, how does the behavior aid in survival and reproduction? Basically, in what way does this behavior make the organism more fit? And the fourth one is, what is the behavior's evolutionary history? If you trace it through a phylogeny, is it a recent adaptation that only occurs in that organism, that species, or closely related species? Or is this something that you see in huge clades of organisms that have not shared a common ancestor for quite some time? And the study of these last two questions, the ecological and evolutionary basis for these behaviors, is behavioral ecology. And this is my favorite area of biology. This is what I spend my time studying. So questions 1 and 2 are considered proximate causation questions, meaning they are how questions. They are physiological questions, and they're questions of an immediate nature, right? How does this organism accomplish this behavior? What stimulus causes it? What organs are involved? And how and when did it develop during the organism's lifetime? The second two questions are why. They're the bigger questions, the evolutionary questions, right? What is the selective advantage, and what is the evolutionary history of a particular behavior? Some behaviors are learned, but other behaviors are innate, which means they are very strictly genetic. You are born with them, and they have very little variation from one time to the next. And one example of an innate behavior is a fixed action pattern. And this is a sequence of unlearned innate behaviors that does not change. It has to go to completion every time you start it. And it's usually stimulated by something called a sign stimuli. This was discovered by Nico Tinbergen himself, who had a bunch of male stickleback fish in tanks and noticed them responding aggressively when a red truck would pass by. And he knew that male stickleback fish reacted aggressively to other male stickleback fish. They're very territorial. and that male stickleback fish have a red underbelly. And he thought, well, maybe it's just the color red that they're responding to, and that is the sign stimulus, the color specifically, not even just the fish, that stimulates the fixed action pattern that is the behavior, the aggressive behavior they show in response. So he did a series of experiments where he made models of fish, and he would put them in with the other male and see if the male had this fixed action pattern of aggressive response. And he had a very detailed model that looked just like a male stickleback but did not have a red underbelly, and he got no response from the real live male fish. But when he made models, even if they were incredibly unrealistic, didn't really look like a male stickleback at all, as long as they had that red underbelly, he would get that response. And so this red underbelly was the sign stimulus. Migration is another example of a behavior that tends to be innate. It's born in the individual, and typically environmental cues are going to trigger a big movement in a particular direction. So migration is a long distance, regular change in location that animals undergo. If you might notice birds migrating right now, and what tips the birds off may be the position of the sun. That can tell you what time of year it is. Right in the summer, the sun gets very high in the sky. As you get toward winter, the sun gets very low in the sky. It could be the length of the days, which is related to that. Could be the position of the North Star in the sky or the Earth's magnetic field that helps them orient themselves in the sky and know which way to go. There are some examples of birds and other migrating organisms that have an organ that has cells with magnetic metal in them and that respond to the Earth's magnetic field. So they essentially have a built-in compass that tells them which direction they're going in. Migration is also an example of a behavior that has a rhythm, in that it tends to be seasonal. It's a circannual rhythm. So the organisms behave differently in the spring than they do in the summer and the fall, right? They may fly north in the spring or the summer, or fly south in the fall or the winter. But there are a lot of behaviors that show rhythm. Sometimes it's a circadian rhythm, meaning a daily rhythm. And organisms will perform certain behaviors in the morning and certain behaviors at night. For instance, there are spiders that are nocturnal, and you'll see them every evening as the sun's going down begin to build the same web over and over and over again. Sometimes they're attached to lunar cycles, tidal movements, things like that. Sometimes a behavior is meant to communicate information to another individual, either of the same species or occasionally of a different species. In this case, the behavior can be a signal, and it sends information meant to be received by another organism. And again, we call this transmission and reception of signals. That second part's important too, communication. There are several different modalities that we can use to communicate. Visual is one example. If I do this, right? If I do this, right? This is a visual signal. Chemical signals are important in a lot of organisms, less so humans. Very often tactile, right? I might tap you on the shoulder or shake your hands. Auditory signals, clearly right now I am communicating to you through the vibration of the air. That's auditory. And often many of these are used at the same time. So spiders, for instance, wolf spiders will frequently use chemical communication. There are pheromones in the silk that a female will put out, and a male will use that to find the female. And certain information's embedded in that chemical signal, like her fitness, whether she's mated before or whether she's eaten recently. Then the male will use a vibratory signal. He's got like a little scraper and file, like a washboard on his legs that he will use to vibrate leaf litter so that you can feel that vibration in the ground. And he has legs that he'll wave at her, and he'll do a little dance. That's a visual signal to show how fit he is and what good genes he has. And again, there's sometimes chemical signal as well. And she may signal that yes, that's good enough by going like this, which is an indicator that she's receptive, because the spider has to crawl over the female's head in order to mate. It's a weird thing, very dangerous in spiders because if the female is not receptive, that head can be used to eat the male. Flies have a similar three-step courtship process. A male will identify a female of the same species and orient toward her, right? And he identifies her via chemical signals. She has female hormones, or pheromones, I should say, in the air, and visual communication. He sees her and is familiar with her form. He will then signal to her, hey, I'm here. He may tap her with a foreleg, and then he can chemically confirm the female's identity by essentially like tasting her exoskeleton. And then he performs a courtship song, which is auditory communication. So he will extend his wings and vibrate them and communicate his fitness. And if all those steps are successful, the female will be receptive and allow him to copulate. And here's our male orienting toward the female and tapping her with the forelegs and buzzing with his wings or singing and hopefully for his sake getting some receptivity. And while a lot of animal communication has to do with sexual reproduction, because for individual species who are not social, that's really one of the only times that they'll communicate with another individual. But sometimes, especially in highly social species, you may have communication for other things, like honeybees, which do a waggle dance to indicate direction and distance of a food source. So bees will go out, worker bees, and look for food, and then they'll come back and they will do a little dance. And if food's just right next to the hive, they'll do this round figure eight dance. If it's a little further away, they have to include directionality. And so they'll use the vertical surface of the hive and they'll go directly toward that vertical surface in the middle of their figure eight. If it's in the direction of the sun, they'll go the opposite way if it's in the opposite direction of the sun. Or if it's, let's say, 30 degrees from the direction of the sun, they will do 30 degrees from the vertical surface, vertical line of the colony. In this way, they're able to communicate a lot of information relatively simply. A lot of animals also use chemicals to communicate between individuals, and these are called pheromones. Honeybees produce pheromones, which control the behavior in some ways of the worker bees and the male drones. Female moths can release pheromones that float in the air for miles to attract males. And certain minnows, when they're injured, they release alarm pheromones to disperse in the water and warn the other fish in the area. And this pheromone can be collected and used experimentally, and you can see this is, this behavior, this hiding and cowering, getting away from the stimulus is going to occur when minnows essentially detect that pheromone. And what kind of signal you use depends on your environment. If you are nocturnal, visual signals aren't going to be very effective, so you primarily depend on olfactory and auditory communication. So pheromones are going to be important, vibrational communication. During the day, visual communication is going to be more important. Auditory communication, also important. Now you have to be careful because these signals can be intercepted, right? You don't want a predator to hear your signal and come eat you, right? Also, they can be mimicked. I mentioned that a lot of female moths release pheromones to attract males. There's an example of a spider, the Bolus spider, that no longer builds a web. It just essentially has like a lasso that it throws that has a sticky bit of glue on the end that can catch moths. And it was found that they eat only a very specific type of moth and only males. And that was weird. And then they discovered, these brilliant biologists, that in that glue were pheromones that mimicked the female moth pheromones. And so you get all these males coming, wanting reproduction, and then boom, they get caught by that spider. Those same biologists did further research on the glue and the pheromones that they're releasing, and they found that they actually change up the pheromone over the course of the summer to attract different moths that happen to be mating at different parts of the season. And so they depend on a single species of moth at a time, but they change the species across the summer.